Hello and welcome to Chess with Simon. I'm Simon. Today we are going to look at a game by England's first chess grandmaster, Tony Miles, and rather appropriately he's going to play the St George's Opening, which is a rare chess opening. So this took place in the European Team Championships in 1980. Tony Miles was a very creative player, very interesting player, feared no one, which is a good job because he was playing Anatoly Karpov, who at that time was world champion, one of the greatest chess players in history, great tournament player, very positional player, very hard player to beat. So the very best in the world struggled to beat him, right? He was world champion. So let's have a look what happens. So Karpov plays pawn to e4. General opening principles say that we should be trying to control the centre, make way for our pieces, and get the king castle to safety. So this is a good move. Black plays pawn to a6. Now, just thinking about the three principles we just talked about, this doesn't really conform to any of them. So it doesn't make way for the pieces, it doesn't control the centre, and it doesn't get the king to safety. It's a very innovative move based on the sort of extreme modern ideas of people like Michael Bassman and to an extent Raymond Keane, and obviously Miles himself was interested in these ideas. So it's sort of what we're doing here is we're opening on the flank. Other related openings are like the Grob and these sort of things. There are lots of very, very respectable modern openings like the Grunfeld or the Reti or the Nimzo Indian, which, you know, the very top players in the world play. But this kind of stuff, pawn a6, this is rare and to an extent frowned on. Apparently, for people in the hall, Karpov showed no reaction at all. There was no discernible response. Some of the spectators were laughing, which brings to mind a comment by Carl Portman, who is a fellow chess player and has given so much to the game. I saw him teaching a group of juniors, and he just basically said, look, people might laugh, people might make fun, people might disagree, but it's your game. It's your game. And I think that's absolutely right. That's one of the great things about chess. You know, you make your own mistakes or not. You have your own great victories or not. It's up to you. And so Tony Miles has chosen to play pawn a6. Karpov plays d4. Has to be objectively the best move. Getting more control of the centre and allowing the queen's bishop out. Black goes on to play b5. Now you can play d5 actually, transposing into some kind of Scandinavian, maybe a d6 Scandinavian. I've seen Carlsen play the d6 Scandinavian with pawn a6, although obviously in a different order. You can play pawn g6, putting the bishop on g7, and then perhaps playing b5 and bishop b7 later. But I think the most consistent idea is to play b5 here. White could play a4, and actually this is quite a positionally motivated idea. The idea here is to already start attacking that pawn that's been stuck on b5. It's attacked twice now, but black can do this, bishop b7. If white takes, black can take here. And then it looks like white can grab another pawn by taking here. But actually, fascinatingly, black can just take this pawn. Because if white takes twice, then this pawn on g2 is hanging. And then black takes off the rook as well. Actually, so black's better here. So, you know, if white takes here, black can take the pawn. Actually, black can also back the bishop up. And that pawn's pinned against the rook. So when white tries an early attack on that pawn, actually, black's got various options. In this game, Karpov just developed the king's knight f3. It's just a sensible move, making way to castle maybe. Black goes ahead and attacks the pawn. Now, Murray Chandler's recommendation here was to play pawn e5, grabbing a bit of space and then taking that away from the focus of the bishop. Black can play like this, perhaps preparing pawn c5, and actually c5 is quite a big theme in this opening. White plays c4, trying to attack quickly, engage space. Black's got the check. White can parry with a knight, but this is reasonable for black. This is not, you know, white's a bit better here, but this is not silly at all. Karpov played bishop d3. I suspect as a highly positional player, Karpov will have really valued having the pawns on e4 and d4 and that kind of perfect centre. So Karpov defends with bishop d3. Miles comes straight out and attacks that pawn a second time before white has had a chance to castle. and then so defend it with the rook. Karpov instead elects to defend with the queen, queen e2. And then Miles has played, again, pawn e6, as we saw on the other line. This could at some stage support pawn c5. The bishop on f8 could support pawn c5. Maybe the pawn on e6 could support pawn d5. There are various ideas that this allows, really. So Karpov plays pawn a4 here. So now starting to attack that vulnerable pawn on b5. Black could possibly bypass it with b4. That is not silly, and it sort of reminds us, doesn't it, of the some of the anti-martial systems in the Spanish opening. But you could do that. Miles plays a much more interesting move, really, which is pawn c5. This is a fascinating move. It seems to be gambiting the b pawn, but actually, if white takes a few times on b5, then his e pawn hangs. So it ain't quite that simple. You know, in some ways, white has to do something about the e pawn. So let's just take a look at this. So takes. So it would be possible to push here. This gets really interesting. So this is a variation. This is not what happened in the match. It would be possible. This is a sort of forcing line, really. White could, and Miles took the view that Karpov wasn't going to do this. So let's just go back and look at what this line is. So this is the game position. So what could have happened here after c5 is takes the rooks off. Black can take back with the bishop. White pushes here. Then black can attack the bishop with the pawn. You know, this is real chess, really complicated stuff. And here we have various branches. So, for instance, the bishop could takes. And here, Miles would favour this sort of idea where the rook starts attacking down the... if white castles here, the rook can go onto g8 and start attacking down that sort of open file. So the point is, so bishop takes looks a bit dodgy. White, of course, can just start grabbing and just take the knight there. Then black would take the bishop, white would take there, black takes here, white takes here. And there's a fascinating line here from Miles. I mean, this shows how deeply he was thinking. So my actual view, when I looked at this position, I thought just castle kingside. Actually, that's what Stockfish wants to do. That's what the engines want to do. So I'm terribly happy about that. Actually, what Miles is, but a very interesting line that Miles showed is queen a5 check, bishop here. Queen goes down to a1. Now again, the line that Miles showed is queen takes b5. Actually, best line for white is just to castle and play it safe. But queen takes b5 is absolutely beautiful. Queen takes b5. So then black can take their check. King moves away. Black's queen is attacked by the rook. There's all sorts of things going on here. Black's queen is attacked by the rook. Black's knight is attacked by the queen. So looks like black's in real trouble here. But black can grab this knight with check. White takes back. And now black has this absolutely amazing move, really. Which is, so he leaves his queen hanging, just to be taken for free, by playing knight c6. Best for white here is to take on c6. And then black takes there. And this actually peters out to a draw. I won't bore you with the details, but with best play, that peters out to a draw. So in this position, this kind of crazy position, best for white is to take the knight on c6. One of the things worth looking at is, well, what if white just picks up that free queen? But the advanced players will see you can pick off that pawn, pick off the queen. So actually in this position, black wins. That's why white needs to take on c6. So, but we're looking a terribly long way ahead, really, if we think about all the complex stuff that happened here. So this would be if Karpov had to play pawn e5. But Karpov, firstly, I think Karpov probably had respect for Miles's tactical ability. But secondly, perhaps he feared a preparation. Perhaps he sort of thought, maybe Miles has looked at all this beforehand, perhaps with other chess players, and he knows what's going to happen. So he's very, very... Players are often very wary about wading into those deep waters when that happens. So what Karpov does is he just takes here. he just takes off this c pawn. But you know, black's taking back, and actually this all looks quite nice for black, really. You know, the bishop develops with tempo. Black swapped his c pawn for the d pawn, which is something that you do in the Queen's Gambit or you do in the Sicilian, so it's quite a nice thing to do. And this all looks reasonably good for black. Now again, white has the option here of playing pawn e5, and Miles was a bit worried about that. He thought the best here was knight to d5, again with a lot of complications. A bit worried about that, but again he thought that Karpov probably wouldn't go for it, and indeed Karpov played knight bd2 to defend that e pawn, basically to renew the attack on the b pawn, because you've got to defend the e pawn to allow you to start taking on the b pawn. So Miles gets rid of that by finally pushing pawn b4. And here Karpov does play e5, you know. So we've all seen this from the c3 Sicilian and from the Alekhine and various things. Black jumps to the nice square d5. White's knight jumps into e4, attacking the bishop, which retreats to a lovely square, good square on e7, good defensive square on e7. So Miles's recommendation here is bishop g5 with some very colourful variations. I'll show you one, which is really beautiful. So put the pawn in the way, takes. If you take back with the pawn, white has got knight e5, which is very, very uncomfortable for black. It does look like the end of days. It's virtually the end of days. So the big threat is queen h5 check, which is incredibly unpleasant. Black can play h5, pawn h5 to stop that, but this is a horror show for because after pawn h5, we'll just look at it on the board. After pawn h5, white has you know, a nasty knight move here. This is not where you want to be as black, particularly not against a Grandmaster. And I mean, actually, there may be a way of holding this, but it's not something that you want to go into. So the point is Miles thought bishop g5 was rather good here. Karpov, again, safe and solid, and safe and solid served him very well throughout his illustrious career. Safe and solid, he's castled. Miles plays knight c6, which is a better move than castling. It's a more active move, and it's a more dynamic move than castling. Karpov develops the bishop modestly to d2, keeping an eye on that pawn on b4, although that's currently well protected. Now, Miles is playing queen c7, again harassing that e pawn. So this is really good modernistic chess, isn't it? Just harassing the central pawns. So now there are two pieces attacking the pawn on e5, only one defending it. So there are two ways that white can defend that pawn on e5. The first is that he can withdraw the knight to g3. And here, black has a range of options. The computer's favourite is to play pawn d6. Chewie's come to see me. Shall we get Chewie onto my knee? Come on, mister. Here's Chewie. He's on my knee. Here's a piece of cheese. Chewie likes cheese. Come on, mister. Look at that. A piece of cheese. He absolutely loves it. One of my kids love playing this game where they both put a bit of cheese on their nose, and then the first one to get their cheese eaten is the winner. Or the last one to get their cheese eaten. Who cares? It's about dogs eating cheese off kids' noses. So, if the knight goes back to g3, you can play d6, you can play f6. Miles even suggests h5, which you can see the logic to, although the computer's not so keen. I mean, black hasn't castled. But you can see the logic. So, there are various good options for black in that case. Karpov plays another good move, and a sensible move, pawn c4. So trying to dislodge that knight in the centre. Black's taken en passant, white takes, black takes, white takes, everyone's taken. And now you've got a bishop on c3 that is defending the e-pawn, so that e-pawn is feeling a bit more secure now. The only problem with this little sequence is it gives black this lovely square on b4 for his knight. And Miles says this rather deep idea, which is getting the knight onto its best circuit. So knights have different circuits, and it's putting the knight onto a good circuit. But more generally, it's basically threatening to capture one of those bishops. Now, white can play bishop b1 here, but it's never really going to work out, because at some point he's probably going to have to take that knight on b4 anyway. So this is frustrating because either you're going to leave black with that strong knight, or you're going to give up the advantage of the two bishops. Now, Karpov could have played bishop e4 here. He chose just to take, but I think afterwards he was wondering if that might not have been the best decision. He does get to hit the queen and take that open file for his rook, which is always good. The queen moves to b6, turns out to be quite a good square for that queen, actually, in the end. And now he's going to swap off this beautiful bishop on the long diagonal, sort of facing down onto white's king, and also take away black's two bishop advantage. Black castles, and at this point, there is an absolutely fascinating option for white to sack the bishop on h7, a so-called Greek gift sacrifice. So, many advanced chess players will be alert to the idea that the idea that you can take on. So let's look at a sort of a basic variation. White takes, black takes back. The knight comes in with a check. If black runs back onto g8, this is immediately over because then the queen can come in, threatening checkmate on h7. The only way to stop that is with the bishop, which then the knight takes off. But even so, now you've got material equal, and white's attack is basically unstoppable. So bishop there. Now the rook's coming around, threatening to come to h3. You can sort of play desperate moves like f5, but it's gone basically. So the point is, with this bishop sacrifice, and Miles had seen all of this, and he judged that Karpov wouldn't go for it. With this bishop sacrifice, if you take after the knight check, you can't go back to g8 because queen h5 just wins. You can't actually go to h6 because this rook move ends up winning. It turns out that king g6 actually does hold. I mean, I've looked at this in some depth with computers. It does hold. Queen comes here, looks very frightening. King's right out there exposed. But black's got an extra piece, and black's got f5. If white takes, you can take with a king, and you can get away. If the queen goes back, now you've got this magical move, really. Queen d4. So after the knight checks, queen goes in the way. Yeah, white gets a rook. There's various swappings off, and you end up with this position where black has the two bishops. Well, black has a rook and two bishops versus two rooks. White has three extra pawns. The computer actually says black's a shade better here. But I think in reality, it's a very interesting position. Maybe a draw. Who knows? I'd be surprised if Karpov let Miles win that. But the point really is that this is a fascinating sacrifice. Very hard to evaluate over the board. But doesn't win for white. That's the basic point. And Karpov sort of... He inverts the move order. So instead of playing bishop h7 check and then knight g5, he just plays knight g5 without sacking the bishop, which is a sort of positional way to handle it, really. But it's very different. Black pushes the knight away, and then now white plays this check, which has been criticised by many, really, as being a bit artificial, although you do see this sometimes in games, but it's been criticised. But it's not a bad move, actually, and the engines don't particularly disagree with this move. But you can do bishop h7 check. This is forced. And it could be, one could hypothesise that white's a bit frustrated here because black's played a wacky opening and he's coming out of it pretty well, actually. He may even have the best of it. So it's certainly, he's got a really nice game. So he's got the two bishops, so maybe white's feeling a bit of frustration or feeling the need to prove something and do a bit of forcing. Bishop comes back, so this is crafty. So what we don't do here is take off the knight on g5 because queen h5 there and it's mate. So we don't do that. What Miles did was bring the bishop back in defence. You could play queen d3 here. That is a perfectly playable move, although black's got g6 to stop the checkmate. Karpov didn't do that. He played knight e4, putting the knight right in the centre of the board. Miles puts his rook on an open file, very sensibly, and as we'll see, that's actually a very, very... It's a very helpful move, actually, having the rook on the open file. I mean, rooks, looking for open files for your rooks is always a sensible idea, but here it is directly useful. Apparently, Karpov played this move very quickly, queen d3. Looks very scary, because all that needs to happen in two moves is knight gets out of the way, queen lands on h7, it's checkmate. So that would be like almost a schoolboy checkmate. So the thing is, Miles will have seen this coming, and other people would be afraid of this, but he's calculated it concretely. And actually, he knows that it's all one move too late. He's always got the one tempo to stop this happening. So firstly, he takes here. So now if the knight moves, he's taking on f1 with check, and he's doing really well. White takes back. Then black simply takes off this pawn. Now black is attacking the rook on c1, again, which he'll take with check. And essentially that's one for black, because, you know, white would have to block with the queen, swap the queens off, it's over. So white here probably feels that it's grim. Various options. Rook c7 isn't great because you got bishop c6, traps the rook and wins for black. I think maybe the engine's like rook d1, but they're all saying black's better here. Karpov played rook e1. Again, black takes another pawn. Just check that knight can't move away with check, because if it could, it would win your queen. But when it moves away, it's not check. And in fact, if the knight does move away, the queen takes the rook on e1 with check. Not checkmate, because the queen can block, but still, end of game. So essentially, that knight's pinned, and it can't move away with check. Karpov just takes consolation in taking off a pawn. And it looks like he's forking the two bishops. Actually, not that simple, because one of the bishops can move away and attack a rook. Karpov's played rook e3. Again, it's getting a bit ragged here. And the modern engines show that queen b2 is an absolute outright win for black. But what he plays is still an outright win. I mean, queen d5. And it's a sort of very human move, which is saying, either I'm going to checkmate you on the back rank. And it's fascinating that, you know, Karpov's world champion. And these sort of back rank checkmates... you know, you usually see them in less experienced players, but it's just the way the game's gone. So I'm either going to checkmate you on the back rank, or I'm going to take your queen, or we're going to force a swap of queens. Karpov takes, Miles takes. So what we're transitioning into here is an endgame in which black has the two bishop advantage and an extra pawn. So I think at this level, best players in the world, this is now just one for black. Let's see how it transpires. So white retreats the knight. Black's attacking the knight and also threatening to arrive again on the back rank on c1 with dire consequences. White's able to move the knight away and protect the back rank, and then black just starts to get the pawns moving, getting his king into the game. So white plays here, black gets the king into the game, swap a couple of pawns, and white wants to get rid of pawns, but the problem is actually this gives black the h-file, as we'll see later. White attacks a pawn, black moves the pawn. White attacks the pawn, black defends the pawn. Rook g4, and then basically what black is doing is centralising those bishops to create those two bishops in the centre of the board, which will control so many squares together. You know, they control... The point about the two bishops is they're able to control both colours and create these sort of boundaries that pieces can't cross. White starts to centralise the king, which is sensible endgame play. Black's now got the two bishops in the centre, white keeps running, and now black switches over to occupy this file, which is really useful, as we'll see, allows him to do a lot of damage. Again, swapping off pawns is good for white, because the fewer pawns there are, the better in this endgame. You got a check from the back from black, and then he's come across to attack this pawn twice, which is only defended once. The pawn advances. Black sort of forks the knight and the rook, although the knight's of equal value to the bishop, so that's not really a fork, but the rook runs away. And now black is attacking this white pawn twice, and although it's defended twice, black can always liquidate the knight, so there's a lot of pressure on this pawn. King just runs, black goes ahead and liquidates the knight, taking on... So now black's got an extra pawn. White goes back to a8, and the bishop defends. Watching the Queen's Gambit reminded me of the romantic old chess days when they used to seal a move. They used to adjourn the game and seal a move, and they would analyse overnight, or they'd analyse before the resumption of play. These days, with modern computers, that's not really that's not done anymore. But it was a sort of lovely tradition, really, and gave an extra sort of sizzle to the game. So at this point, Tony Miles sealed the move bishop c7. Karpov, having looked at the game, decided just not to play on. So he decided this position was completely gone. So essentially, he looked at it and he said, with those two connected black pawns, even though there are opposite coloured bishops on the board, which can lead you to a draw. We've still got the rooks on. With those two connected passed pawns, there's no way for white to even draw this. So Karpov resigned the game, and actually Miles winning this game with black against the world champion allowed England to draw 4-4 in the European Team Championship against Russia, who are, of course, historically, you'd say, the greatest chess nation in history. And certainly this was a great achievement for the English team. Must have been a very happy day. And, you know, Miles did it in an enormously individualistic and unconventional fashion, which just makes it all the more interesting. In the next video, I'm going to play a couple of blitz games online against unsuspecting people, and I'm going to play some of these ideas. This is one of the fun things in chess, is to look at what the great players have done and then try to play games and see if you can use some of the same ideas or develop your own ideas or develop their ideas. See how other players respond to it. So I'm going to post another one in the next day or two where I try to do this in a couple of blitz games. But for now, well done, Tony Miles. Rest in peace. You blazed the trail for other English and British Grandmasters. You sort of showed them it could be done. And this is a game I've really enjoyed playing. And absolutely no disrespect to Karpov. He's a wonderful player. I have bought many of his books. And on this occasion, a bad day at the office. But it happens to the very best of us. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please do subscribe to the channel or press like if you liked. And I really look forward to seeing you next time.